The man nobody looked at arrived at 6:44 in the morning. Gray uniform, worn boots, a mop cart that squeaked once on the turn through the side door and then went quiet. He moved through the corridor the way furniture moved. Present, unnoticed, expected to be there without anyone remembering why. The waiting room was already full. Plastic chairs bolted together in long rows. Fluorescent lights buzzing above heads that had stopped hearing them. A woman filling out a form she didn't understand. An old man in the corner holding his own chest with one hand, carefully, the way you held something that hurt when it moved. He had been there since 5 in the morning. Nobody had stopped. The man with the mop moved past the intake counter, past the clerk, past the supervisor in the navy polo, who said something low to a new hire that made her nod without looking up. The mop went forward. The mop went back. And the man watched everything. Treat them with kindness. The fluorescent lights above the waiting room had been buzzing for so long that nobody heard them anymore. That was the first thing Mark Anderson noticed when he walked through the side entrance of Callaway Regional Medical Center at 6:41 on a Monday morning. Not the smell, not the crowd, the buzz, constant, mechanical. The sound of a building that never actually slept, just dimmed. He was wearing a gray uniform 2 sizes too large. The kind of gray that used to be some other color, and gave up trying to remember what. Steel-toed boots with a scuff across the left toe that he had put there himself the night before. Dragging the boot across the edge of his apartment parking lot 3 times until it looked right. His ID badge said Roy Sims in laminated black letters. The photo on the badge was genuinely him, which he had always found to be the strangest part of undercover work. You hand someone a fake name attached to your real face, and they believe both. The cart he pushed was standard issue. Yellow plastic bucket on wheels. A flat mop with a gray head that smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and something older underneath. He had picked it up from the supply room 40 minutes earlier, after the facilities manager, a tired man named Gerald, had pointed him toward a row of hooks on the wall and said, "Welcome aboard," without looking up from his phone. Mark pushed the cart through the side corridor and into the main body of the emergency department wing. The waiting room opened up in front of him. Rows of plastic chairs bolted to each other in long strips, most of them occupied. A television mounted high on the wall played a morning news program with the volume too low to actually hear, just loud enough to be aware of. A woman near the back held a sleeping infant against her chest and stared at the ceiling. An older man in a yellow rain jacket sat with his elbows on his knees, his face aimed at the floor, his lips moving slightly. Mark moved slowly. The mop went forward. The water spread. He pulled it back. He was watching everything. This was the part nobody understood about undercover inspection work. People assumed it was about disguise. The costume, the fake name, the practiced walk. But the costume was never the point. The point was to become someone the room decided was not worth noticing. A janitor with a mop was invisible in a hospital waiting room the same way a lamp was invisible. You registered it was there. You never looked at it. He had been doing this for 22 years. He had walked through 38 facilities before this one, in various states of institutional neglect. And the single most reliable constant across all of them was this. Nobody looked at the man with the mop. He moved closer to the check-in desk. The desk was a long counter that ran across the eastern wall of the waiting area, divided into 4 stations. 2 stations had people behind them. One station had a sign that said temporarily closed in a plastic placard that had clearly been there long enough to be permanent. The 4th station had a half-eaten granola bar on top of a closed laptop and no person. Brian Thompson stood at the center of the counter. Mark had studied Brian Thompson's personnel file for 40 minutes in his car the previous evening. 45 years old. 15 years with the hospital, the last 6 as head of patient intake for the emergency department. Commendations in years 2 and 5. A performance review from 2 years ago that described him as efficient and outcome-focused, which in hospital HR language meant he moved numbers through the system without creating friction. And friction usually meant patients asking difficult questions. Brian Thompson was not a large man. Medium height, medium build. The kind of physical presence that said, I am exactly as important as I think I am. He wore a Callaway staff polo in the hospital's navy blue and carried a tablet under his left arm, the way some people carried a clipboard, like an extension of authority rather than a tool. He was talking with kindness. He went to one of the two staffed intake clerks, leaning slightly over the counter, his voice low enough that Mark could not make out words from his current position. Mark pushed the cart another few feet toward the corner nearest the counter. He found a section of tile that was technically clean and began mopping it anyway. The intake clerk Brian was speaking to was young, mid-20s maybe. Short brown hair pulled back. Her name tag said Courtney. She was nodding at whatever Brian was saying with the expression of someone who had learned that agreement was faster than comprehension. A man in his late 50s walked up to the counter. He was wearing a heavy canvas work jacket, despite the mild morning, the kind of jacket that had been purchased for function and served that function for a long time. His hands were the hands of someone who had operated machinery for decades. He set a folder of papers on the counter and said something that included the phrase I called last week and the phrase I need to see someone today. Courtney looked up. She looked at the folder. She looked at the man's jacket. Then she looked at the station to her left, which had a short line forming, and said something back to the man that made him reach for the folder and walked toward the longer row of chairs near the north wall. The man with the canvas jacket sat down in the 5th row and set the folder on his knee and looked at the television that was too quiet to hear. A few minutes later, a woman came through the automatic doors near the ambulance bay entrance. 52, Mark estimated. Well-tailored blazer in a dark burgundy. Hair that was expensive without announcing it. She moved through the space the way people moved through spaces they were accustomed to being welcomed into. Not running, not anxious. Simply present and expectant. Brian Thompson looked up from his conversation with Courtney. He walked around the counter. He met her before she reached the check-in line. Mark watched Brian extend a hand, say something that caused the woman to smile with one side of her mouth, and then gesture toward the corridor to the left of the counter. The corridor that led away from the waiting room. The corridor where the rooms were. They walked together. Brian spoke. The woman nodded once. They turned a corner and were gone. The man with the canvas work jacket watched them from the 5th row. Then he looked back down at his folder. Mark kept mopping. He turned the cart and moved slowly toward the eastern corridor, following the path Brian and the woman had taken at a distance that suggested he was simply following the natural flow of foot traffic. He was not hurrying. Slow and purposeful, looked like someone who had been told to mop this section of corridor and was doing that, nothing more. The corridor had 4 rooms on each side. The room at the far end, room 12, had its door closed. Through the narrow window beside the door, the lights inside were on, and a figure in navy scrubs was moving around the bed. The edge of a vital signs monitor was already running. The woman in the burgundy blazer, whose name he would later confirm from the chart visible through the corridor window as Laura Clark, had been inside that room for less than 9 minutes after walking through the front door. Mark turned the cart around, moved back toward the waiting room. The man with the canvas work jacket was still in the 5th row. Mark positioned the cart near the water fountain alcove, which gave him a natural reason to stay in that section of the waiting room without mopping the same tile twice. He wrung out the mop. He checked the bucket level. He took 2 steps back, and then he heard it. Brian Thompson had returned to the counter. He was speaking to Courtney again, his voice still low, but the waiting room had a particular acoustic property in the morning. Before it filled to its midday volume, that allowed sound to carry in unexpected directions. The alcove was one of those directions. No coverage, they wait, Brian said. Standard processing. That's how it works here. Don't let them tell you different. Courtney was writing something on a form. She nodded without looking up. The board cases go to intake 2 or directly to the wing, Brian continued. You'll know them when you see them. You'll figure it out fast. He said it the way someone said it when they meant you already know. This is just the official version of saying it out loud. Mark did not move. His hand was on the mop handle. The mop was still. Would you treat them with kindness? He was looking at the wall 6 inches to the left of Brian Thompson's shoulder, which was the correct place to look when you were a janitor resting for a moment and not listening to anything. He heard the words go through him the same way the fluorescent buzz had when he first walked in. Not shocking, recognizable. The kind of thing that lands without surprise and still manages to be heavy. He had heard variations of this sentence in 11 of the 38 facilities he had inspected over his career. It was never phrased as a policy. It was always phrased as common sense. That's how it works here. You'll figure it out fast. The language of a thing that has been normalized so completely it no longer requires justification, just orientation. Mark picked up the mop again and kept moving. He had been at this hospital for less than 2 hours. He moved through the morning. Patients came and went, or mostly came and waited. The intake rhythm at the counter had a pattern that became clearer the longer he watched it. It was not dramatic. That was the thing about systemic problems. They were never dramatic from the outside. They looked like normal operations. They looked like a busy Monday morning at a large public hospital. Patients with visible insurance cards, or patients who arrived in a certain way, speaking a certain way, wearing clothing that implied a certain kind of professional life, moved through the initial intake conversation faster. They were directed to chairs closer to the intake corridor. Their wait time, from what Mark could observe, was shorter. Patients who arrived without those signals waited longer. They were directed to the rows farther from the corridor. They filled out more paper forms. They were asked to confirm information multiple times, not aggressively. The staff was not hostile. They were simply slower. And slow, in an emergency department, was a form of decision. Around 8:15, a woman came through the main doors pushing an older man in a wheelchair. The man was gray-faced, 70, maybe older. He was holding his left arm against his chest with his right hand, carefully, the way you held something that hurt when it moved. They reached the counter. The intake clerk asked for his insurance information. The woman behind the wheelchair said he didn't have current coverage, but he was a Medicare patient and she had the paperwork. It was just at home. She hadn't had time. She had called the hospital from the car. Could someone please? The clerk said she understood and handed over a form. The woman took the form. She looked at it. She looked at the man in the wheelchair. She started writing. Mark was mopping the section of floor near the water fountain again. He had mopped it 4 times now. It was the cleanest tile in Sacramento. A nurse came through the corridor door. She was mid-30s. Dark auburn hair pulled back under a clip that wasn't quite doing its job. One loose strand curving along the side of her face. She was moving fast, the kind of fast that nurses who had been doing this for years used, the pace that didn't waste energy but covered ground. Her name tag read N. Torres, RN. She was carrying a chart. She glanced at the board above the intake counter. She looked out at the waiting room. She stopped. She looked at the man in the wheelchair. She changed direction. She walked to the counter and said something to the clerk. The clerk started to respond. Nicole Torres had already turned back toward the man in the wheelchair. She crouched slightly, putting herself at his eye level, and spoke to him directly. The man in the wheelchair said something. His right hand was still holding his left arm. Nicole straightened. She went back to the counter, said 2 more words to the clerk. The clerk picked up the phone. 4 minutes later, the man in the wheelchair was being moved down the corridor. Mark watched this and felt something that was not quite the word he would have used in an official report. What he felt watching Nicole Torres change direction in a busy corridor was something that did not fit on a form. Something closer to relief that it still existed. Whatever it was that made a person stop. Nicole came back through the waiting room, moving toward the corridor again, her chart still in hand. She glanced at Mark as she passed. The brief acknowledgement of a shared space, cast or the way people looked at furniture when they were looking past it. Mark nodded once. She was already through the door. He stood in the alcove with the mop and thought about his father. He didn't mean to. He never meant to, and he always did anyway. In hospitals, His father had been 51 years old when he walked into the emergency room at a hospital in Bakersfield with chest pain that had been going on since the previous evening. He had worked construction for 26 years. He had large hands and a methodical way of approaching problems, and had always, his whole life, waited until a thing was clearly necessary before doing it. The chest pain had become clearly necessary sometime around 7 in the morning. He had sat in a waiting room for 3 hours and 40 minutes. The chest pain had been a myocardial infarction that was, according to the attending physician's notes, which Mark had obtained and read twice in his late 20s when he finally thought he could handle it, already significantly advanced by the time his father's name was called. His father's name had been Robert Anderson. Robert Anderson had not been carrying an insurance card. He had not been dressed in a way that suggested urgency. He had been a large, quiet man in a work jacket with a chest that hurt, sitting in a row of plastic chairs in a hospital that had decided, not cruelly, just systematically, that he could wait. Mark was 19 when it happened. He had not been at the hospital that morning. He had been at a job site across town, running electrical cable for a contractor who was paying him $8.50 an hour, which was why he had not driven his father to the hospital, because someone needed to be working. And his father had said it was probably nothing and go to work. By the time Mark got the call, his father had been dead for 2 hours. He had stood them with kindness in that hospital parking lot in his work clothes with insulation dust on his forearms, and looked at the building and understood something that he would spend the next 29 years trying to find a systematic, useful, professionally appropriate way to address. He put the notebook away. He went back to work. Around 10:30, Brian Thompson reappeared from the direction of the administrative corridor. He had his tablet. He walked to the counter, spoke briefly to the current intake clerk, checked something on the tablet, and then walked out toward the parking structure through the exterior door near the ambulance bay. Mark noted the time. He noted the direction. He gave it 4 minutes. Then he told Gerald through the internal radio that he was doing an exterior check of the east side drain covers per the morning task list, and went through the exterior door. The parking structure was a 3-level concrete building attached to the hospital's eastern face. Mark moved along the eastern wall, staying close enough to it to be invisible from the structure's upper levels, and found a position behind a service vehicle where he could see the first row of the staff lot. Brian Thompson was standing between 2 cars in the second row. He was not alone. The other man was 40-something, in a business casual jacket that was trying to look informal and not quite making it. He was holding a flat envelope about the size of a standard greeting card but thicker. He handed it to Brian Thompson. Brian did not open it. He put it in the interior pocket of his staff jacket, in the way someone put something away when they already knew what it was. They spoke for approximately 3 minutes. Brian was relaxed. The other man was making a point, gesturing once toward the hospital building, once toward a phone he produced from his pocket and held up briefly. Brian nodded. The other man put the phone away. Brian nodded again. The other man walked to a silver sedan parked in the visitor section. He got in. He drove out. Brian went back inside. Mark stayed behind the service vehicle for another minute. Then he walked back to the exterior door and went inside. He found a corner near the staff restroom and wrote in the small, precise handwriting he used for case notes. Entry 1. Intake redirection pattern. Visual confirmation. Direct quote from Thompson to new intake staff. Entry 2. Room 12. Early access. No visible triage. Patient identified as L. Clark escorted directly by Thompson. Entry 3. Torres N. Spontaneous triage deviation. Positive. Entry 4. Thompson exterior meeting. Approx 10:38. Individual unidentified. Male 40s. Business casual. Physical exchange. Flat envelope placed in interior jacket pocket by Thompson. Silver sedan. Partial plate only. He put the notebook away. His phone buzzed. His supervisor's name was Gary Pullman, and Gary Pullman had the communication style of a man who believed that important information should be delivered the way a brick was delivered, directly and without cushioning. The text said, Someone at Callaway submitted an inquiry to state oversight about an upcoming review. Asking for credential details, don't know who initiated. Assume you have 3 days max. Mark read it twice. Then he put the phone back in his pocket and picked up the mop and went back to work. 3 days was fine. He had closed cases in less. He returned to the waiting room. The morning had moved toward 9, and then past it, and the room had thickened. More chairs occupied. An elderly woman near the front with a walker and a paper bag of medications she kept arranging and rearranging on her lap. A man in his late 60s who had been sitting in the 4th row since before Mark arrived, whom Mark had been tracking with peripheral attention all morning without making it obvious. 68, maybe. The age that looked like it used to be stronger and still had the posture to prove it. But something in the careful way he held himself said that sitting here this long had cost him something. He had a folder on his knee, hands that had worked hard for many years. He had been watching the corridor doors since before 8. He had not been called. At 9:40, a different intake clerk leaned over the counter and called something into the general space of the room that was not quite loud enough to reach the back rows clearly. The man in the 4th row did not respond. The clerk called again louder. The man looked up, said something, stood carefully. He was directed back to the long row near the north wall with the information that there had been a paperwork question and he would need to wait while it was resolved. He sat back down. His face did not change. He had the face of someone who had already made peace with the specific kind of waiting that had no reliable endpoint. Mark moved the cart toward that section of the room. He worked slowly. The mop went forward and back. The tile was already dry. He kept moving. He reached the row where the man was sitting and stopped near the wall, 2 feet away, to check something on the underside of the cart that did not need checking. The man looked at him briefly. "Morning," the man said. Mark looked up, nodded. "Morning." A pause. The kind of pause that in a waiting room had no weight attached to it. "New," the man said, not nosy, just something to say. "First week," Mark said. The man nodded. "Good hospital to work at?" "Seems all right," Mark said. "You been here long?" "Since 5. Mark looked at the clock on the wall above the television. It was 9:58. "They told me there was a problem with my paperwork," the man said. "Flat informational. They've told me that twice now. You feeling all right?" A brief consideration. "Chest's been off since last week. Figured I'd come in, get it looked at. Didn't want to make a fuss about it earlier." Mark looked at the man's folder, looked at his face. He kept his own expression neutral. "They'll get to you," Mark said. The man almost smiled, not quite. "I expect they will eventually." Mark straightened, started moving the cart again. "Name's George," the man said. Mark kept it natural. Barely a pause. "Roy." George White nodded and looked back at the corridor door. Mark moved the cart toward the supply alcove and stood with his back to the room for a moment, facing the cleaning products on the shelf, his hand on the handle of a bottle he was not going to open. He had a man with chest pain who had been waiting since 5 in the morning. He had a triage system that had moved Laura Clark to a monitored room in under 9 minutes. He was not a treating physician. He was Roy Sims, janitor first week, no medical authority, no standing to intervene in patient care, and intervene them with kindness was the kind of thing that ended an investigation before it gathered the evidence that could actually produce systematic change. He knew all of this. He also knew the difference between a chest that was off and a chest that was preparing to do something that could not be undone. He turned around. He scanned the room for Nicole Torres. She was somewhere behind the corridor door. He moved the cart to a position near the corridor entrance and kept working and waited. When Nicole Torres came back through that door just before noon, he let the cart's back wheel make contact with the door as it was closing, which made a noise, which caused Nicole to turn, which gave her a line of sight directly back into the waiting room, where George White was sitting in the 4th row with his folder on his knee and his hand pressed against his chest. Nicole stopped. She looked at George. She changed direction, the same way she had done with the man in the wheelchair before 8 in the morning. No visible decision, just the result of one. She walked to George. She crouched to his level. She spoke to him. He answered. She looked at the hand he had against his chest. She said something else. He said something back. She straightened and went to the counter and spoke to the intake clerk for approximately 40 seconds with the tone of someone who was not asking. 12 minutes later, George White was in a room. Mark pushed the cart back to the supply alcove. He stood in the alcove for a moment and looked at the cleaning products on the shelf. He thought about Brian Thompson saying no coverage. They wait. That's how it works here. He thought about Nicole Torres changing direction in a busy corridor because she saw a man holding his own chest in a row of plastic chairs. He thought about Laura with kindness. He thought about Laura Clark in room 12 with a vital signs monitor already running 8 minutes after she walked through the front door, while George White had been sitting with a folder on his knee since 5 in the morning. He went back to work because there was more to do and the day was only half over. At 3:15, he left through the side entrance and sat in his car in the visitor lot and called Gary Pullman. 3 days, Mark said when Gary picked up. I know. How bad is it? Mark looked at the hospital building through the windshield. 4 stories of concrete and glass and buzzing fluorescent lights that nobody inside could hear anymore. It's not dramatic, Mark said. That's the thing. It's not people yelling at patients or refusing care outright. It's a system that has learned to move certain people through quickly and other people through slowly, and nobody had to write a memo about it because everybody already understands it. That's harder to document, Gary said. I know. You need more time? Mark looked at the notebook on the passenger seat. 4 entries today. He would need more. He would need the triage logs. Would you treat them with kindness? He would need to understand the envelope Brian Thompson had put in his jacket. He would need to know who the man in the business casual jacket was and whether it went further up than Brian Thompson. I need 3 days, Mark said. You have 3 days, Gary said, and hung up. Mark sat in the car for another minute. The parking lot was busy with the shift change. Nurses coming out. Day staff going to their cars. Night staff arriving. Still carrying travel mugs. Still wearing the expression of people adjusting to what they were walking into. He watched them without watching them. Then he started the car and drove home to eat something and sleep for 5 hours and get up and do it again tomorrow. Because that was the job, and the job was the thing he had chosen, and he had chosen it for a reason that still held, even after 22 years, even in a gray uniform that used to be some other color, even in a hospital that had learned to be slow in ways that did not show up easily in any document he had ever been handed. He drove out of the parking lot without looking at the building again, but he already knew he would be back at 6:40 tomorrow morning, because somewhere on the 4th row of plastic chairs in that waiting room, a man named George White had just gotten into a room that he had been trying to reach since 5 in the morning, and the thing that had finally moved him. There was a nurse who had looked at him, really looked, across a crowded room, and changed direction. That was worth documenting. That was worth everything it took to document it properly. Day 2 arrived before the light did. Mark was in the facility by 6:38, earlier than his established pattern. 2 days left. Maybe 3 if the HR inquiry moved slowly. Not enough time to let things develop at their natural pace. He pushed the cart through the side corridor and into the main body of the ER wing, and the waiting room was already a third full. 6 them with kindness? 40 in the morning and 30-something people had already found their way here, which said something about the night that preceded this morning for each of them. He moved through his established route without thinking about it. The route was muscle memory now. The tile near the water fountain. The alcove by the corridor door. The section beside the counter that put him within hearing range of the intake desk without being close enough to register as present. Brian Thompson wasn't in yet. The morning intake clerk was a man Mark hadn't seen before. Late 30s. Efficient in a different way than Courtney. Less tentative, more practiced at moving people through the initial exchange without offering anything beyond what the exchange required. Mark watched. The pattern was still running without Brian. That was the thing about a culture that had embedded itself deeply enough. It didn't require the person who built it to be in the room. The people who worked inside it had absorbed it the way you absorbed the temperature of a place, Not through a decision, but through simple prolonged exposure, until the temperature felt like the air itself. He passed room 4 on his way to the supply alcove, and through the narrow window beside the door he saw George White sitting up in the bed, not lying down, sitting, watching a television mounted high on the wall with the particular stillness of someone who had concluded that the situation was what it was and was managing it accordingly. A breakfast tray sat on the table beside him. He had eaten roughly half of it. Mark did not stop. He noted the room number and kept moving. George White was stable. That was one thing that was true this morning. At 7:54, Nicole Torres came through the corridor door. She was moving at her usual pace, chart in hand. The clip in her hair was the same one from the previous day, performing the same insufficient function with the same single strand escaping along the side of her face. She passed within 6 feet of Mark without looking at him. Then she stopped, turned back. Room 7 drain is still the same, she said. I put it on the list yesterday, Mark said. It's been on 3 lists, not accusing him, telling him the history. I'll flag it as urgent. She looked at him for a moment, with the expression he had begun to recognize. The one that recalibrated slightly each time she saw him, like she was adjusting a measurement she had already taken once, and was finding it came out different on repeat. You actually put it on the list, she said. Yesterday afternoon. In the system. A brief pause. Most new people don't bother the first week. Not a compliment, an observation. Seems worth bothering, Mark said. She went through the corridor door and the door swung closed behind her. At 8:22, Brian Thompson arrived through the staff entrance. He did not have the expression of a man who had slept normally the night before, which was the first deviation from his established pattern that Mark had observed. Brian moved to the counter, spoke to the intake clerk, checked something on the tablet, with more attention than the checking usually required, and then stood looking at the waiting room in a way he had not stood before, scanning. Not the usual operational survey of the room. This was searching. Brian was looking at specific individuals rather than the room as a system. He was looking at the new staff. Mark's hands were on the mop handle. The mop was moving, forward, back. The tile was already clean. Brian's gaze moved across the alcove section. Mark was looking at the wall. After a moment, Brian returned his attention to the tablet and walked toward the administrative corridor. At 9:40, Dr. Sandra Williams moved through the glass panel's line of sight inside the administrative suite. He had seen her only in the personnel photo in her file before this. 54 years old. The reality, observed through a glass panel while pushing a mop cart past a door, was someone who carried the weight of a large institution in the set of her shoulders, not hunched, straight, the kind of straight that required maintenance. She was speaking to someone off his line of sight. Her expression was focused in the way of someone presenting information they would prefer not to have to present. One hand flat on the table, a gesture of laying something out. Mark noted it, moved past, did not stop. At 11:19, Nicole Torres came into the break room. She did not appear to have expected him to be there. She looked at him briefly and went to the coffee machine, poured, turned around. Mark was at the counter by the sink. 8 years, he said. She looked at him. You said 8 years yesterday. Working here. I did, Nicole said. That's a long time to stay somewhere you said used to feel different. A silence, not hostile. Considering. People stay for a lot of reasons, she said finally. She drank the coffee. She was looking at him with the measurement quality again, more active today than the day before. She was deciding something. You're asking a lot of questions for a janitor in his first week, she said. I notice things, Mark said. It's a problem I've had my whole life. What kind of things? He let that sit for a moment. Then, the man in room 4. George White. He almost didn't make it to a room yesterday morning. He was sitting in the waiting room from before I came on shift. He had chest symptoms. He was sitting right there in the open, and the system didn't move him. Nicole was very still. You moved him, Mark said. The second time. When you saw him sitting there holding his chest. First time too, she said quietly. I know. The first time was the man in the wheelchair. She set her coffee cup down on the table. She looked at the cup, then she looked at him with a clarity that had shifted the quality of the room. "Who are you?" she said. Not aggressive, not afraid. Simply a person who had finally asked the question they had been building toward for 2 days. Mark said nothing immediately. The break room was empty except for both of them. The corridor outside had foot traffic that moved past the window in the door at intervals. He calculated the interval. Long enough. "Someone who's been watching this place the same way you have," he said. "For different reasons. For the same reason, actually." She was watching his face with the focused attention of a person who had trained herself to read situations accurately. "You're not facilities," she said. "No." A pause that lasted several seconds and contained an enormous amount of thinking on both sides. "How long?" she said. 2 days in. "I have maybe 2 more." She absorbed this. She was not frightened. She was recalibrating, adjusting the entire framework through which she had been looking at Roy Sims' Janitor. First week. Notices things. "The log restructuring," she said. Not a question. "Tell me." She looked at the door. She looked back at him. "Not here, and not today." She picked up her coffee cup. Afternoon break, 3:30. The stairwell at the north end, 3rd landing. There's never anyone there. She went to the door. She looked back once. "I've been waiting 2 years for someone to actually show up," she said. Her voice flat, with something that was not relief yet, more like the cautious acknowledgement that something might be about to change. "Don't make me regret it." She left. Mark stood at the counter for a minute after she was gone. He breathed carefully, methodically. Then he went back to work. At 2:50, Brian Thompson did something Mark had not seen in 2 days of observation. He walked directly to the supply alcove. Mark was in the east corridor, 20 feet away, with the cart between him and Brian's line of sight. He stopped moving. He watched. Brian stood in the doorway of the supply alcove looking at the interior, looking at the shelf layout, looking at the task log clipboard that hung on the hook inside the door. He took the clipboard down. He looked at it. He hung it back up. He was checking whether Roy Sims had been where Roy Sims was supposed to be. Mark did not move until Brian had walked back toward the administrative corridor. The north stairwell was exactly what Nicole had described. Institutional concrete. No patient access, no regular staff use. The 3rd landing had a small window that looked out at the parking structure and admitted a column of afternoon light that lay across the steps at an angle. Mark arrived at 3:22. He sat on the top step of the 3rd landing with his back against the wall and waited. Nicole arrived at 3:31. She was carrying something. Not the chart she usually carried. A manila folder. Personal, not hospital issue. The kind of folder a person owned rather than requisitioned. She sat on the step across the landing from him. She looked at the folder. Then she looked at him. "I want to know something first," she said. "Okay. What happens to this place when you're done? Not the official outcome. What actually happens?" It was the right question. It was the question that people who had been through the experience of institutional complaint and institutional non-response always needed answered before they gave anything. "I can't guarantee a specific outcome," Mark said. "I can tell you that what I document goes to a review board that has prosecutorial authority, not just recommendation authority. That's the difference between this and an internal complaint process." 3 complaints, Nicole said. 2 years ago, 18 months ago, 14 months ago. "Do you want to know what happened to each one?" "Yes." First one was routed to Brian Thompson's department for internal review. She said it with the flatness of someone delivering a fact they had long since stopped being surprised by. Second one was acknowledged by AS as received, and then nothing. The third one I was called in for a conversation with Brian Thompson himself, where I was told, that my concerns showed admirable commitment, but that I might want to consider whether I was interpreting patterns that reflected industry-wide challenges rather than specific institutional failures. A pause. He used those exact words, industry-wide challenges. I wrote them down when I got home. "What did you do with that?" Mark said. She opened the folder. Inside were 3 printed emails. Each one had a date stamp at the top. The most recent was from 14 months ago. The earliest from 26 months ago. The sender on all 3 was an internal Callaway address. The recipient on all three was a different internal address. She handed them to him. He read them. The language was precise and institutional, and designed to say something through the arrangement of things it did not quite say directly. The phrase efficiency-based triage allocation appeared in the second email and was defined in a way that was nominally about resource optimization and actually about the systematic prioritization of high-coverage patients through the intake process. The third email referenced a review of incident log categories and recommended reclassifying a set of delayed care incidents as standard processing variants rather than adverse events. Standard processing variants. That was the phrase. That was the thing the nurses in the break room had meant when they said the logs were restructured. Not the format of the logs, the category of the events recorded in them. The incidents had not been removed. They had been reclassified, which meant they were still there. Still findable if you knew which category to look in and knew that the category itself was the product of a deliberate decision rather than an accurate clinical judgment. Where did you get these? Mark said. Someone who left 14 months ago. She had access to the administrative email archive before she went. She gave me these because she thought I'd know what to do with them. Nicole's voice was steady. Would you treat them with kindness? The steadiness of someone who had been carrying something heavy for long enough to have adjusted their posture around the weight. I didn't know what to do with them. I kept them because throwing them away felt wrong. You kept them for 2 years. I kept them waiting for someone who wasn't going to lose them in a desk drawer. Mark held the 3 emails and understood that he was holding the thing that changed the shape of this case. Not the parking lot exchange, not the intake pattern documentation, not the behavioral observations. This. 3 emails in the institutional language of administrative decision-making that could be laid against the documented triage pattern and would demonstrate clearly and incontrovertibly that the pattern was not organic, that it had been built. Sandra Williams, Mark said. Is she the sender on these? Nicole looked at the emails without touching them. No. The first 2 are from a deputy administrator who left the hospital before I joined. The third is from Brian Thompson. But Williams knew. I don't have documentation of that, Nicole said carefully. I have an inference, based on 8 years of watching how this place makes decisions. Tell me the inference. Nothing in this hospital's administrative structure happens at Brian's level without Sandra Williams knowing about it. Brian doesn't have the authority to reclassify adverse event categories. That's a medical administration decision. He wrote the email. But someone with clinical administrative authority signed off on the reclassification. That signature would be in the incident log audit trail, which you don't have access to. No. A pause. She does. Mark was quiet for a moment. Can you make copies of these? He said. I already did. These are the copies. She looked at the folder. The originals are somewhere safe. He looked at her. 2 years, he said. Somebody has to care, she said simply. Without drama, without the weight of performance behind it, just a person, stating the thing they believed to be true, in the tone of someone who had arrived at the belief the hard way. If I leave, there's one fewer person here who actually does. He handed the 3 emails back. She put them in the folder. She tucked the folder under her arm. What do you need from me? She said. Nothing more right now. What you've given me is significant. That's a careful word. I'm a careful person. She almost smiled. Not quite. You're the least convincing janitor I've ever seen, she said. I've been told I'm too purposeful. You look at things like you're trying to remember them exactly. Occupational habit. She stood. She straightened her scrubs. She looked at him one more time with the measurement quality at its most precise. What happens to the people who did this, she said. Not the institution. The people. That depends on what the documentation supports. The envelope Brian took in the parking lot on Monday is a criminal matter if it's what it appears to be. The reclassification of adverse events in official medical records is a regulatory matter at minimum and potentially a criminal one. And Sandra Williams. He met her eyes. Depends on whether she directed it or permitted it. A pause. Legally, those are different. Practically, for someone in her position, they're not very different at all. Nicole absorbed this. I've worked for her for 8 years, Nicole said. Not defending her, not excusing her. Just the fact, sitting there in the afternoon light of the stairwell. She used to do rounds. She used to come down to the floor. 3 years ago she stopped. I don't know when it became easier to not look than to look. It doesn't happen in a day, Mark said. No, Nicole said, it doesn't. She turned toward the stairs. I hope you get what you came for. She went up the stairs and through the door at the top, and the door closed behind her without a sound. Mark sat on the landing for another few minutes. The light through the small window had shifted to the late afternoon angle. He could see the upper level of the parking structure. He could see the spot where Brian Thompson and the man in the business casual jacket had stood on Monday. He took the notebook from inside his jacket. Entry 8 Torres N. Direct contact established. Second day. Provided copies of 3 internal emails, sourced from former administrative employee. Contents confirm efficiency-based triage allocation policy. Adverse event reclassification directive. Critical documentation. Confirms administrative level awareness of intake pattern. Need to determine extent of Williams' involvement. Source credible, motivated by institutional accountability, not personal grievance. He closed the notebook. At 5:50, his shift was scheduled to end at 6. Would you treat them with kindness? He was in the west corridor running the last section of his route when he passed the administrative suite and saw through the glass panel that the lights were still on inside. Sandra Williams was at the table. She was alone. She had a phone to her ear and one hand flat on the surface of the table, the gesture of laying something down between people, except there was no one else in the room. She was managing something. Kindness. There was a difference in how the body handled managing versus controlling, and the difference was visible in the set of her shoulders, in the hand on the table, in the particular way her head tilted as she listened to the response from whoever she was speaking to. She was answering to someone. Someone above her, above the hospital's administrative structure, which meant the hinge point was not just Brian Thompson's parking lot arrangement with a broker. Sandra Williams was caught between something above her and the floor below her, which was where Nicole Torres worked and George White had sat for 5 hours, and the incident logs had been reclassified. Mark returned the cart to the supply room. He signed out through the facilities log. He walked to his car. He had tomorrow. One day. He needed it to land the Williams layer. He thought about his father in that parking lot in Bakersfield. He thought about George White, sitting in the 4th row, with his folder on his knee. He thought about Nicole Torres on the 3rd landing of the north stairwell, saying somebody has to care with the flat certainty of someone who had long since stopped expecting anyone to agree with her and had decided to act as though it were true anyway. He put the car in drive. One day. It was going to have to be enough. 3. Mark was in the hospital parking lot at 5:49, engine off. The facility in its overnight configuration, most of the upper windows dark. The ER bay lit and active because the ER bay was always lit and active. He was reading his reconstruction of the 3 emails Nicole had given him, written from memory, in the notebook the night before, with the detail and precision that 22 years of training had produced. He had reconstructed them with specific language, where he was certain and notated uncertainty where he was not. The phrase he was uncertain about was in the section describing the new efficiency-based triage allocation parameters. Would you treat them with kindness? He had the beginning and the end of the sentence, but not the middle. The middle mattered because it was the hinge between describing the policy and describing the basis for the policy, and the basis was where the directive either came from clinical administration, pointing to Williams, or from an external consultancy, pointing somewhere else entirely, and potentially higher. He went inside and became Roy Sims for the last time. The morning moved at a different pace than the previous 2 days. He was more deliberate today, more conscious of time. He had developed an intuition across 22 years for the shape of a case's final day, the particular quality of the hours before a thing resolved. Brian arrived at 7:41. He went directly to the counter and then, without his usual operational survey of the room, walked toward the administrative corridor. Purposeful. At 8:15, Mark found a position outside the administrative suite glass panel that gave him a line of sight into the room without being visible from the primary angle inside. Brian Thompson was sitting across from Sandra Williams at the conference table. Williams was listening. Brian was speaking. The tablet was on the table between them, turned so Williams could see the screen. Brian pointed at something on the screen. Williams leaned forward with kindness. Williams leaned forward slightly. Mark could not read the screen or lip-read the conversation, but he could read the sequence of responses. Williams looked at whatever Brian was showing her for approximately 12 seconds. Then she leaned back. She asked something. Brian answered. She asked again. She was nodding now, but it was not agreement nodding. It was the nodding of someone absorbing information they were going to have to make a decision about. Williams put her hand up. The stop gesture. Flat palm extended. She said something. Brian sat back. She said something else. Brian picked up the tablet. She stood. She was coming toward the door. Mark moved. Not fast, not conspicuous, just repositioned. The cart rolling forward naturally, as though he had been moving along this section of corridor all along. Sandra Williams came through the door. She was looking down at the phone in her hand. She nearly walked into the cart. She stopped. Looked up. Mark said, sorry, with the automatic apology of someone who had done something minor and reflexive, and moved the cart to the side. Williams looked at him. Then at the cart. Then at his badge. Facilities, she said. Yes, ma'am. Roy Sims. I'm sorry about that. No, she waved it off. It's fine. She started to move past him. Dr. Williams, he said. She stopped. She looked back. He had made the decision. A small and deliberate breach that put him in a conversation with Williams that he would not otherwise have access to. I was here Monday morning, he said, in the waiting room. Before I started, I was there for a couple of hours, waiting on a friend, an older man sitting next to me, been there since before 5 in the morning. Chest pain. He kept waiting. Williams was looking at him with full attention now. I just wondered, Mark said, if that was normal here. Williams said nothing for 3 seconds. What's your name again? Roy Sims. Facilities. First week. She looked at him. She looked at the cart. She looked at the corridor behind him. That man, she said carefully. Is he being cared for now? He is, yes. I saw him in his room yesterday. Something crossed her face that was not relief, not guilt, not either of those cleanly, but a territory between them. The terrain of a person who had been told the outcome was acceptable and was discovering that acceptable and right were not the same coordinate. Then he received the care he needed, she said. And would you treat them with kindness? Something in her voice said she knew how that sentence sounded, and she knew it was not the answer to the question that had actually been asked. Mark looked at her. He kept his face neutral. And then Sandra Williams did something he had not anticipated. Is it normal? She said slowly, repeating his question back, as if hearing it for the first time from the outside, for someone with chest pain to wait from before 5 to past noon. She was not asking him. She was saying the words out loud the way you said something you had been not saying for long enough that finally hearing it in your own voice was a different experience than knowing it in your head. The hand that was not holding the phone came up and pressed against her own collarbone briefly. No, she said, quietly. It's not normal. She walked down the corridor. She did not look back. Mark stood with his hands on the cart and watched her go. He wrote entry 9 in the notebook 7 minutes later, in the supply room with the door closed. Entry 9, Williams, S. Direct Contact, Administrative Suite Corridor, Day 38, 26 a.m. Response to observational question regarding intake delay confirms awareness. Direct statement, no. It's not normal. Behavioral indicators consistent with Williams, experiencing acknowledged responsibility in real time, not for first time but in new form. This is not new knowledge for her. It is old knowledge she has been managing the distance from. He closed the notebook. She was not the architect of the triage allocation system. She was the administrator who had known about it and had created over time the psychological and institutional architecture necessary to continue presiding over it. That architecture had been built of layers. each one a small accommodation to the reality of running a large, underfunded public hospital under board pressure and efficiency mandates. The layers treat them with kindness. The tune accumulated until the distance between her and the floor below her was large enough that she could read reports rather than take rounds. Until a janitor with a mop cart had asked her if it was normal, and she had heard herself say no. That was the moment. Not the emails, not the intake logs, not the parking lot exchange. Those were the documentation. But the moment was this one. He had 3 hours left in his shift. At 12:40, Eric King came into the ER bay. He was 24 years old, and he was walking on his own, which was the only thing that was functioning correctly. His face was the gray-white color that pain produced when it had been going on long enough to exhaust the body's ability to respond to it. Would you treat them with kindness? The person with him was the same age, maybe younger, moving with the urgent helplessness of someone who knew something was wrong and did not have any of the information required to fix it. They reached the counter. The intake clerk asked for insurance information. Eric King said something short. The clerk said something back. Eric said something else. The clerk slid a form across the counter. Mark was 30 feet away near the corridor door. He watched Eric take the form and look at it with the expression of someone who had been handed a test in a language they did not speak. He watched the treat them with kindness. He watched the person with him start to fill it out with the urgency of someone increasingly uncertain they were solving the right problem. He watched the color of Eric King's face. He had seen that color before. 22 years ago, in a different capacity, working as an EMT before he came to the State Department. He had seen it on patients in ambulances and in living rooms, in the specific them with kindness, in the specific clarity of an emergency that had been developing for longer than anyone realized and had finally passed the threshold where the body stopped being able to manage the appearance of managing it. He put down the mop. He walked to the corridor door and, through it, and found the first physician he could locate in the wing. A doctor standing outside a patient room reviewing a chart, and he did not pretend to be Roy Sims in that moment, because Roy Sims was not going to be enough. There's a patient at the intake counter in the ER waiting room, Mark said. 20-something. He's been in pain long enough for it to show in his face, in a way that means it's past the form-filling stage. The doctor looked at him, at the gray uniform, at his face. Mark said, "Right periumbilical. The way he's holding himself." The doctor was already moving. Mark stepped back. He watched through the glass panel in the corridor door as the doctor came through the waiting room. Watched him reach the counter. Watched him look at Eric King for approximately 4 seconds. Watched him say something to the intake clerk, and then say something directly to Eric, and watched Eric's shoulders drop slightly, the unconscious physical response of a body that had been told it was going to be taken care of. The doctor walked Eric King into the corridor in under 3 minutes from the moment he arrived at the counter. Mark stood in the corridor. He breathed. Eric King was in a room. Would you treat them with kindness? And Mark Anderson stood in the corridor and felt the weight of 22 years and 38 facilities and one specific morning in Bakersfield settle around him, the way things settled when you had done the thing you were there to do. Would you treat them with kindness? Even when the thing you were there to do was not finished, because there was a difference between doing the thing and completing it. He went back to work. At 3:47, Brian Thompson walked directly to the facilities manager's office. Mark heard about it 4 minutes later through the internal radio. Gerald's voice saying, "Roy, when you get a chance, swing by my office." And Gerald's voice had the careful neutrality of someone who had been asked to deliver a message and had not been told why. Mark took the long way. He thought about Gerald. 2 days of working in this building, and Mark had taken the measure of him in the ways that mattered. Gerald was a man who was comfortable when he was alone, with his phone and his task lists and the simple mechanical logic of facilities management. Would you treat them with kindness? When Brian Thompson had come to his office with questions about a background check, Gerald had not immediately called Brian back with whatever he found. He had called Roy Sims. Because some part of Gerald, the part that had been working in institutional settings long enough to develop a feel for when something was not what it was presented to be, had decided them with kindness. To tell the person the correct move was to tell the person the situation was about, rather than the person asking about it. That instinct would matter in the next few minutes. Mark reached Gerald's office. Gerald was behind his desk. He was not comfortable. Brian Thompson from Patient Intake came by, Gerald said. He's asking about your background check. Says there's a discrepancy in the HR system. Mark looked at Gerald's face and calculated what Gerald knew versus what Gerald suspected versus what Gerald was willing to do with either. Gerald, Mark said, I need to make a phone call. Gerald looked at him. A phone call, Gerald said. To the State Department of Health. A silence. Gerald's expression moved through several stages in approximately 4 seconds. Confusion. Recalibration. Something that was not understanding yet but was adjacent to it. Then a stillness that said he had arrived somewhere and was going to stay there. Take whatever time you need, Gerald said. He picked up his phone and looked at it, and appeared to become very interested in whatever was on the screen. Mark stepped into the hallway. He called Gary Pullman. Tomorrow morning, Mark said when Gary answered. Send the team at 8. I'll be there. You have what you need? Gary said. Mark thought about the emails, about the parking lot, about the intake log's kindness. Rogue Trenisht would have restructured before the team arrived, but which the audit trail would show had been restructured and when. About Sandra Williams in the corridor saying, It's not normal in the voice of someone finally agreeing with themselves. I have what we need, Mark said. He hung up. He stood in the hallway outside Gerald's office for a moment. Tomorrow, he would walk into this building differently. Would you treat them with kindness? Tonight, he would spend 2 hours on the phone with the review board's lead attorney, and 4 hours writing in the notebook, and 2 hours not sleeping, and 1 hour staring at the ceiling of his apartment, thinking about the shape of the thing he was about to do, and whether it was enough. It was enough. It had to be. Because George White was in a room on the 4th floor, and Eric King was in a room somewhere in the surgical wing, and Nicole Torres had carried 3 emails in a folder for 2 years waiting for this, and the people in the waiting room that he had walked through 3 mornings in a gray uniform would keep sitting in those chairs until someone made the building treat them like the reason the building existed. He went back inside. He picked up the mop. He finished the shift. He wore the gray uniform one last time. Not because he had to. The cover was functionally over. Brian Thompson had already flagged the discrepancy in the HR system. Gerald knew. Would you treat them with kindness? He could have come in at 8 in a suit and a state credential and gotten straight to the room where the meeting would happen. But he put the uniform on anyway, because there was something he needed to do first. And he needed to do it as himself, not as whoever he became when he was representing the State Department of Health in a formal capacity. He needed to do it as the man who had pushed a cart through these corridors for 3 days and had learned the precise acoustic properties of the water fountain alcove and knew which tile near the intake counter would be wet at 7:30 and dry by 9. He arrived at 6:44. He signed in through the facilities log for the last time and took the cart from its hook and moved through the side corridor into the main body of the building. The waiting room at 6:44 on a Wednesday morning looked the way it always looked. Like a room that had been carrying people through difficult mornings for a long time and would continue to do so after today and after whatever came from today. The plastic chairs, the low television, the fluorescent buzz that nobody inside heard anymore. A woman near the window was filling out a form on her knee. An older man in the second row was looking at nothing in particular, with the patience of someone who had learned that patience was the only tool available. Mark moved through the room without stopping. He took the west corridor to the patient wing. He went to the 4th floor. He found room 414. George White was sitting up in bed. The breakfast tray was in front of him. He was not eating. He was looking out the window at the parking structure, at the morning light coming over it, at the ordinary Sacramento sky doing nothing in particular. He heard Mark come in and turned. He looked at the gray uniform. He looked at Mark's face. He did not say anything for a moment. "You're early," George said finally. "Little bit," Mark said. "My daughter was here last night." He gestured at the chair beside the bed. "She drove up from Fresno." "Good," Mark said. "She's worried." George's voice had the particular flatness of a man describing something he found both touching and unnecessary. She thinks this is more serious than it is. What do the doctors say? Coronary artery disease, early stage. Manageable. A pause. Turns out I've had it for a while. I just didn't know. Mark pulled the chair away from the wall and sat down beside the bed. He had maybe 40 minutes before he needed to be in a different part of this building in a different configuration. You were in that waiting room a long time Monday morning, Mark said. George looked at him with the particular attention of a man recalibrating what he was looking at. Not the uniform. The face behind the uniform. I was, George said. I was watching, Mark said. Not as facilities staff. A silence. Longer than the ones before it. No, George said slowly. I didn't think you were. How long did you know? George considered this with the same care he seemed to apply to most things. Second day. When you came back. Janitors in their first week don't usually come back and check on specific patients. He looked at the window. I didn't know what you were, just knew you weren't what you said. Mark looked at the man in the bed. 68 years old. Chest that had been off for longer than a week. He was now certain. Because coronary them with kindness. Because coronary artery disease that registered as early a stage in the imaging had been developing quietly for years, while George worked and waited and decided not to make a fuss about things that might not be anything. I'm sorry it took that long, Mark said. For them to get you into a room. George looked at him directly. Is that what you're here about? What happened to me Monday? It's part of it, Mark said, not just you. The pattern you were part of. Because I don't have insurance. Because of what happens to people here who don't, Mark said. Consistently. In a documented way. George was quiet for a moment. The morning light was moving across the floor of the room as the sun cleared the top of the parking structure. I've been coming to hospitals my whole life, George said. Different ones. Different cities. And there's always been a difference. He was not angry when he said it. His voice was even and factual. The voice of a man describing a condition of the world that he had long since absorbed. Not always the same difference. Sometimes it's the waiting. Sometimes it's the way people look at you when you come in. Sometimes it's just a feeling. But it's always there. I know, Mark said. And does it actually change? George said. When people like you write their reports. Mark sat with the question. He had been sitting with that question for 22 years. He had a version of the answer that was honest and not the answer people wanted and was the only answer he trusted. Sometimes, he said. Not all at once, not because of one report, but the reports are the record, and the record builds. And eventually the record becomes the thing you can point to when you're trying to change a policy, or remove a person or restructure a system. It moves slowly. He looked at George. But not moving is worse. George absorbed this. Then he almost smiled, the same almost smile from the waiting room. That's not a very satisfying answer. No, Mark said. It isn't. But it's true. As far as I can tell. George looked at the window again. At the sky over the parking structure. At the ordinary Wednesday morning conducting its business outside. The nurse who got me into a room, he said. Nicole. She came by yesterday. Just to check. She didn't have to. No, Mark said. She didn't. Some of them still care, George said. Not as a consolation. As a fact he had verified through direct observation and wanted the record to include. That matters. Mark stood. He looked at the clock on the wall above the door. 31 minutes. He extended his hand. George shook it with the hand of a man who had operated machinery for 40 years. The grip that did not perform strength but had it anyway. Take care of yourself, Mark said. You too, George said. Son. Mark walked out of the room. He went to the stairwell at the north end of the building. He went up one flight to a single-occupancy restroom on the 5th floor that he had identified on day one as the most reliably private space in the facility. He locked the door. He took the gray jacket off. Underneath it was a white dress shirt he had put on that morning under the uniform. He had the jacket of his suit in a bag in the locker in the facilities room, which he would retrieve in 12 minutes. He had the tie in the bag. He had his state identification in the inside pocket of the jacket. He had the notebook. He stood in front of the mirror above the sink. Roy Sims looked back at him for the last time. He washed his face, dried it, looked again. Mark Anderson looked back at him. tired in the way that the end of a case always produced, the specific exhaustion of sustained double consciousness, of being two people in the same body for 3 consecutive days, and something else. Something that was not quite the word he would write in the report, but that was present in the mirror alongside the tiredness. He had done the thing he came to do. He had done it the same way his father had done the things he came to do, with his hands close to the ground, without expecting the situation to accommodate him. He put the gray jacket in the bag. He went to get the suit jacket. At 7:58, Mark Anderson walked into the lobby of Callaway Regional Medical Center in a navy suit with a state identification badge on a lanyard and a notebook under his arm. Would you treat them with kindness? Behind him were 2 members of the review team, Margaret from the department's compliance division, and a documentation specialist named Lawrence who had driven up from San Francisco the night before. The morning intake flow was running. The waiting room was filling toward its midday density. The fluorescent lights were buzzing. Brian Thompson was at the counter. He looked up at the 3 people coming through the main entrance. He looked at the credentials. He looked at Mark's face. It took him approximately 2 seconds. His expression did the thing that expressions did when the thing a person had been anticipating arrived in a form they had not fully anticipated. He had known someone was coming. He had not known. The someone had already been here for 3 days, wearing a gray uniform. Mark walked to the counter. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," he said. "My name is Mark Anderson. I'm a senior inspector with the California Department of Health. We'll need us access to the administrative conference room and to Dr. Williams. We'll also need the triage logs for the past 18 months and the incident report archive for the same period." Brian Thompson opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. "I'll need to verify your credentials." Mark placed his state identification on the counter. Brian looked at it. He looked at Mark's face. He looked at the gray uniform that was no longer in evidence, but was very clearly still present in the room. "You were here," Brian said. His voice had the flatness of a man arriving at a conclusion that did not improve anything. "I was here," Mark said. "Since Monday morning." A silence. The intake clerk beside Brian was very carefully looking at her computer screen. Brian picked up the phone. At 8:17, the 3 of them were seated in the administrative conference room. Would you treat them with kindness? The table was the same table Mark had seen through the glass panel, the same surface where Sandra Williams had laid her hand flat in the posture of presenting difficult facts. It looked different from inside the room than it had from the corridor. More ordinary. Furniture was always more ordinary from the inside. Sandra Williams came in at 8:21. Would you treat them with kindness? Her expression when she entered and saw Mark Anderson at the table was the expression of a person for whom a suspicion they had formed in the last 14 hours was being confirmed. She sat down at the head of the table. She looked at Mark directly. "The janitor," she said. "Yes." "How long?" 3 days. Monday through this morning." She processed this with a stillness that was controlled and complete. Then she looked at the notebook on the table in front of him, and at the 2 people from the State Department beside him, and at the manila folder Margaret had placed on the table. "I'll need our legal counsel present," Williams said. "Of course," Mark said. "We can wait." She made the call from the room. Legal counsel would arrive in 40 minutes. Would you treat them with kindness? She put the phone down and sat at the head of the table, with the particular quality of someone who had decided how they were going to move through the next several hours, and were now waiting for the movement to begin. Brian Thompson was not in the room. He was in his office, 2 doors down, with Lawrence going through the past 18 months of intake records. This had been requested formally, and Brian had complied, which was the correct decision, and also not a decision that would ultimately help him. The 40 minutes were the kind of 40 minutes that seemed shorter in retrospect than in the room. Mark used them to organize his materials. Margaret reviewed the folder she had brought. Lawrence set up the documentation system. Williams sat at the head of the table and drank water from a glass and did not use her phone. At 9:03, the legal counsel arrived. He was a man in his early 50s named Richard, and he had the calm of a hospital attorney who had been through compliance reviews before. which meant he was oriented toward minimizing institutional damage rather than disputing the inspection's legitimacy. Mark opened his notebook. He began. He did not make a speech. He presented evidence in sequence. The way 22 years of practice had taught him to present it, each entry with its date and time and observational context, each quote reconstructed with the notated degree of precision, each behavioral pattern described in the language of documented incident rather than interpretation. He presented entry 1 through entry 9. He took approximately 40 minutes. He described Laura Clark, 8 minutes from the front door to a monitored room, escorted personally by Brian Thompson. He described George White, 5 hours in the 4th row. He described what separated those 2 mornings and what did not. He placed Nicole Torres's 3 emails, now properly documented, and entered into the state record on the table. He described the parking lot exchange with the man in the business casual jacket. He described the efficiency-based triage allocation pattern, day by day, the intake clerk instructions, the corridor redirection, the time differential between insured and uninsured patients, across 3 days of sustained observation at multiple times of day and across multiple intake staff. He described Eric King. When he finished, the room was quiet, in the way rooms were quiet when the people in them were processing rather than preparing to speak. Richard was writing on a legal pad. Margaret was looking at her folder. Lawrence had everything recorded. Sandra Williams was looking at the table. She had not looked away from the table for the last 12 minutes of Mark's presentation. Then she looked up. "I want to say something," she said, "before Richard advises me on what to say." She looked at her attorney briefly, who looked back with the expression of someone who had learned that telling certain people to stop talking was not a productive use of his skills. She looked back at Mark. "I knew the intake patterns were not equitable. I had the numbers. The efficiency metrics that the board was tracking produced a picture that, if you laid it against the actual patient population, told a story I chose to read as an industry-wide resource challenge rather than a policy failure." She stopped. She was not performing confession. She was not performing remorse in the way that people performed remorse when they were managing a situation. She was stating something she had apparently decided to state in the hallway the previous morning when she had heard herself say it's not normal in a voice she did not fully control. "I stopped taking rounds 3 years ago," she said. "I told myself it was because my administrative load had increased." That was true. It was also not the reason. A pause that held the weight of something she had been working out in private for a long time. The reason was that the floor told me things the reports didn't, and I had reached a point where I found it easier to read the reports. Richard put his pen down. Williams looked at him. "I know," she said. She looked back at Mark. "I'll provide full cooperation," she said. "Complete access to all administrative records including the incident log audit trail and the board correspondence regarding efficiency metrics. All of it." Mark looked at her. All of it," she said. "Because it doesn't stop here. What Brian was doing with the insurance broker is its own matter, and it's yours to pursue. But the efficiency directive that created the conditions for the intake pattern came from the board, and the board was responding to a set of financial pressures that are not unique to Callaway." She folded her hands on the table. "If you're going to fix this, you need the board correspondence. You need to see where the directive originated." Mark wrote one word in the notebook: significant. The meeting continued for 2 more hours. Richard interjected at intervals with appropriate legal guidance. Williams answered questions she was advised to answer and declined others, which was the correct and expected behavior and did not change the direction of the record being built in that room. At 3:30, Mark called an end to the formal session. "Would you treat them with kindness?" He told Williams and her attorney that the review team would be back in the building within the week for follow-up documentation access. He told Williams that her offer of full cooperation would be noted in the formal record and that the manner and extent of her cooperation would be relevant to the review board's determination of her role and liability. Williams nodded. She stood. "Would you treat them with kindness?" She looked at Mark with the expression of a person who had arrived somewhere they did not want to be and understood that the not wanting was not the relevant factor. The man in the waiting room, she said. Monday morning. He was admitted? He was, Mark said. He's stable. Coronary artery disease, early stage. She absorbed this. She looked at the table. He should have been in a room by 7:30, she said, at the latest. Yes, Mark said. He should have. She left the room. Richard followed her with the careful pace of an attorney managing the distance between his client and whatever came next. Mark sat at the conference table alone. Margaret came in from the hallway and set a document on the table in front of him. The first page of the formal inspection record. His name at the top. The date. The facility. The nature of the review. He signed it. He put his pen down. He sat for a moment. He had been in this building since 6:44 in the morning, and it was now 3:47 in the afternoon, and the last 3 days had produced a record that would go before the review board within 60 days and would result in, at minimum, a formal corrective action plan for the facility and a referral of the Brian Thompson parking lot arrangement to the State Attorney General's office and a full audit of the incident log reclassification and its impact on patient care outcomes over the 18-month period in question. What it would result in beyond that was not his to determine. He understood his part in this clearly. A good inspection could produce a record, and the record was what you gave to the people who fixed systems, and the fixing took longer than anyone wanted and was never as complete as anyone hoped. But not having the record was worse. He stood up. He went to find Nicole Torres. She was in the east corridor, coming out of a patient room, chart in hand, moving at the pace she always moved. She saw him in the corridor in his suit and his state credentials, and she stopped. He looked different from Roy Sims. He looked like himself. She looked at him for a moment. It's done, she said. The initial session is done, he said. There will be follow-up. But what you gave me is in the record. Formally documented. He looked at her. You'll receive official notification of your status as a cooperating witness. That gives you formal protection from any institutional retaliation. She absorbed this. Brian, she said, referred to the AG's office for the broker arrangement. The facility will conduct a review of his intake management protocols. His employment status is at the discretion of the interim administration. Williams resigned, voluntarily with full cooperation. The review board will determine the consequences. Nicole looked at the corridor, at the door she had just come out of, at the direction of the ER wing and the waiting room beyond it. What happens here in the meantime? She said. To this floor. The board is required to appoint interim administration within 30 days. The triage protocols will be under direct state monitoring during that period. She was quiet. Will you still be here? He said. When the interim administration comes in. Where else would I go? She said it without self-pity and without the performance of noble sacrifice. Simply as a person, describing the decision they had made about their own life, which was that this was the work, and this was where the work was. Mark looked at her. The record reflects what you did here, he said. Not just the emails. The 8 years. He paused. That's in there too. She looked at him for a moment with the measurement quality at its most precise and most final. Thank you, she said. Would you treat them with kindness? Not with the weight of someone who had been waiting for recognition. With the weight of someone who had not expected it and found that it mattered more than they had known it would. She went back to work. He watched the corridor door close behind her. He walked back through the building. He passed the administrative suite. Dark now, the lights off. The conference table, visible through the glass panel, empty, the chairs pushed back in the arrangement of a meeting that had concluded. Would you treat them with kindness? It was a room that had the past several hours, the documented truth of a place that had been telling a different story about itself for 3 years. He passed the break room, the water cooler, the fluorescent light above the counter that was slightly brighter than the one beside it because it had been replaced more recently. He passed the water fountain alcove. He passed where he had spent the equivalent of several hours over the past 3 days mopping a section of tile that did not require mopping, listening to the acoustic channel that ran between the alcove and the intake counter. He walked through the waiting room. Would you treat them with kindness? It was mid-afternoon, and the room had the particular texture of mid-afternoon in a place that ran continuously, slightly less full than the morning, the people in it in the stages of a waiting that had been going on long enough to become its own kind of endurance. A woman near the door was talking quietly to someone on her phone. A man in the third row was asleep, his head at the angle of someone who had not meant to sleep, and had done it anyway. Mark walked through the room. He walked out the main entrance into the afternoon. The Sacramento light hit him directly, warm and flat and completely indifferent to what had just happened inside the building behind him. The parking lot was full. People were coming and going. Shift change for the afternoon staff. Visitors arriving with the expressions of people carrying something they hoped the people inside could help with. He stood outside the entrance for a moment. 6 weeks later, the review board issued its findings. The corrective action plan for Callaway Regional Medical Center ran to 47 pages and required the implementation of blind intake triage protocols, meaning intake staff would process the initial clinical information of a patient before the insurance status was entered into the system, which was a structural change rather than a behavioral instruction, and therefore more likely to produce lasting effect. It required a full classification of the 18 months of restructured incident reports, restoring 112 delayed care incidents to their accurate category in the official record. It required mandatory staff retraining on equitable care protocols across all intake and triage personnel. Brian Thompson's referral to the Attorney General's office resulted in an investigation that extended to 3 other facilities in the state with similar arrangements involving the same brokerage firm. The criminal process was its own timeline, slower than the regulatory one, and it was still running when Mark finished writing his case notes. Sandra Williams did not return to healthcare administration. She accepted a consulting role with a patient advocacy nonprofit that worked on health equity policy, a decision the review board noted in its final summary as a consequential personal response that fell outside the regulatory framework but was nonetheless part of the record. Eric King had his appendix removed. He was discharged 3 days after admission. The hospital's charity care program covered his procedure in full. He did not know about the inspection. He did not know that the doctor who had ordered his imaging had been prompted by a man in a gray uniform who was not a janitor. He knew that a doctor had looked at him and decided he needed help. That was what he knew. It was enough. George White was discharged on a Thursday. His daughter drove him home to his apartment. His cardiologist had given him a management plan, a set of medications, a follow-up schedule. He would be monitoring his heart for the rest of his life, which the cardiologist said was the correct approach, and which George received in the same flat, factual register he received most information. He would be all right, probably, in the way that all right meant something different at 68 than it did at 30. 3 months after the inspection closed, Mark received a letter. It was handwritten on plain white paper in the careful script of someone who had not written many letters recently, but had decided this one warranted the effort. The letter was from George White. It was 4 paragraphs. The first described them with kindness. The first described the apartment and the morning walks the cardiologist had recommended, and the fact that the walks were better than expected. The second described his daughter's visits, and the way she brought food he hadn't asked for, and how he had learned to not object to this. The third was about the waiting room on Monday morning, about sitting in the 4th row with a folder on his knee, about the particular quality of being invisible in a place that was supposed to help you, and about the particular quality of being seen, finally, by a person whose job it was not. The 4th paragraph was 1 sentence. It said, "I just wanted you to know that someone noticed." Mark read the letter at his kitchen table on a Thursday morning, with coffee he hadn't touched going cold on the counter. He read it twice. He folded it and put it in the front pocket of the notebook. Would you treat them with kindness? The notebook that had 9 entries and a case number on the cover, and 47 pages of Vying Sons, 1 sentence at the front from a 68-year-old man who had been in the 4th row since before 5 in the morning, and had held his own chest, and had waited and had been seen. He closed the notebook. He had a case 40 pending. A hospital in Fresno. complaints about emergency triage and differential treatment based on insurance status. Fresno, where he had grown up, where his father had worked. Not the same hospital, a different building, probably different people at this distance of time. But Fresno. He stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking at the street below, the ordinary morning street. People walking in both directions. Cars. The convenience store on the corner with its lights still on from the night. The world conducting its business. He thought about what it meant to notice. Not in the abstract. Concretely. In a waiting room at 6:40 in the morning. In the fourth row. With a folder on your knee and a chest that had been off for longer than a week, and the patience of someone who had long since made peace with being invisible in rooms that were supposed to help you. To notice was to change direction. That was all it was. You were moving in one direction, and the room gave you a signal, a face, a posture, a held arm, a set of symptoms that were visible if you were looking for them, and you changed direction. You went toward it instead of past it. Nicole Torres changed direction in a corridor without being asked. She had been doing it for 8 years, every day. While the system around her ran in the other direction, and she had not stopped, because stopping had never seemed like a viable option to her, or if it had, she had looked at it as an option and decided it wasn't one and kept going. Mark Anderson had spent 22 years building the records that required systems to change direction, whether they wanted to or not. His father had died in a waiting room because no one changed direction. These 3 facts lived in the same body, and he had learned, over 22 years, to carry all of them. He picked up the coffee. It was cold. He drank it anyway. He put the notebook in his bag beside the Fresno file. He picked up his keys. Outside the kitchen window, Sacramento was doing what Sacramento did in the morning, moving, being ordinary. Carrying through their days. Carrying its people through their days in the particular combination of intention and accident that made up the daily life of any city, any collection of people, any accumulation of ordinary mornings that were, each one of them, someone's difficult morning. He walked to the door. He had a flight at 6:15. The record had to be built. One case at a time, one corridor at a time. One entry in a small notebook that fit in the inside pocket of a gray uniform jacket that still smelled faintly of industrial cleaner. And the building of it was the thing. Not because it fixed everything. Because not building it fixed nothing. He drove north on the highways, and the morning opened up around him, and he kept his hands on the wheel and his eyes ahead, and did not look back.